We could in general summarize the four categories of painting as being realism, expressionism, abstraction, and non-representationalism. Realism is the approach that tries to mimic the outside world pretty much the way it is. Abstraction, in the large sense, is about distorting images from the outside world. Non-representational has to do with using forms that are purely invented, that are textures, shapes, lines, and the like that don't represent anything from the outside world. Expressionism has to do with using forms from the outside world and distorting them in some way, though not as much as abstraction. We could say that loose realism is when realism is distorted, but just a small amount. This would, in a sense, make it a mild form of expressionism. Yet this is typically referred to as loose realism. It's when the formal elements, like color, texture, shape, and the like, have been put before realistic accuracy. When things are changed even further, we could call it minor expressionism. This is when things are distorted enough that we can't really call it realism. Impressionism is an example of this approach. So we could, in a sense, call Impressionism minor expressionism. When we look at things in this way, taking distortion even further, we get into what might be called major expressionism or basic expressionism. Vincent van Gogh, an artist of the late 1800s, often called a post-impressionist, is well known around the world as one of the most emotional and expressionistic painters. He tended to use slightly primitive form, thick, buttery brushstrokes, and bright, vivid color to create an intensity of expression that ranks at the top amongst the most expressive paintings ever made. Van Gogh's paintings have the emotional quality that makes intense expression evident. We can see in Van Gogh's touch, in his heartfelt brushstrokes, a humanity that we can all identify with. A contemporary of Van Gogh's, who was also one of the most powerful Expressionist painters, was Paul Gauguin. Gauguin said, "An emotion can be translated instantly. Envision it, dream of it, and seek for it in the simplest form." How do you see this tree? Is it really green? Use green then, the most beautiful green on your palette. And that shadow, is it rather blue? Don't be afraid to paint it as blue as possible. Edward Munch was an artist of the late 1800s, early 1900s. He's known as one of the most emotional and expressive painters of his time. And brought a palpable psychological quality to bear in his work. Edward Munch. A work of art can come only from the interior of a person. André Derain was another of the founding fathers of Expressionism. His involvement with Expressionism led to the group of artists between 1905 and 1908 called Fauvists, or wild beasts. They were called this because they took color to an extreme. Pablo Picasso was one of the most extraordinary expressionists of all time. As we look back over Picasso's work, we can see that he worked in both abstract and expressionistic veins. His work was some of the most creative, expressionistic, irreverent, and playful work of the 20th century. Between 1910 and 1930, a group of artists led by Ernst Kirchner began working in an expressionistic style that became known as German Expressionism. The artists included Gabriel Munter, Max Beckmann, Jelensky, and Kokoschka. It might be said that German Expressionism was a pure form of Expressionism, without the element of abstraction. After the opening decades of the 20th century and German Expressionism, many artists experimented with Expressionism and just what it could be. In the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, in what's called the postmodern era, artists experimented further with Expressionism. Cindy Sherman was part of the explosion of women artists in the 90s. She made herself up as different types and photographed herself, then blew the photographs up to painting size. She blurred the distinction between painting and photography. Kenny Scharf is one of the premier artists of the postmodern era. His paintings were a blend of cartooning, graffiti art, pop art, and surrealism.